Hey kids, it's Chef Jack again. I want to thank you for joining me here for the second chapter in the History of Comics tribute to Jack Kirby. As I said before, Kirby had an absolutely monumental influence on comic books, and we're going to delve into it. This time I'm here to talk about Kirby in the Silver Age. But before I go on, I have to touch on the reason why comics went from the Golden Age to the Silver Age in the first place. That reason can be summed up in 4 words. Seduction of the innocent. Dr. Frederick Wertham was a German-born psychiatrist who had fled Germany for the United States ahead of the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. Once in America, he gained some notoriety by way of his many books and his citations as an authority on the human psyche, and his being called to testify on the sanity of Albert Fish, a man who some believe to be the worst serial killer in American history. I don't want to say the man was a kook. The man was not a kook. He was an experienced, expert psychiatrist. But in one particular area, I personally believe that he was crazy as a loon. Wertham was a firm believer in the purportedly harmful effects of violent imagery on television, in the movies, and most especially in comic books when it came to the development of children. In 1954, he published his book, Seduction of the Innocent, in which he described overt or covert descriptions of violence, sex, drug use, and other unacceptable content within the quote-unquote crime comics. Now, he used the term crime comics to not only to describe actual crime comics that dealt with police stories and gangster stories, but he also used it to described superhero tales and horror comics with monsters. The book was mostly based on undocumented and unsupported opinion and anecdotal evidence, and he blamed the rise in delinquent behavior in American children on the comic books. Among his many accusations were that, well, for one, Batman and Robin were obviously an openly homosexual couple. And even worse, Batman was clearly a homosexual pedophile. He said that there were hidden images of nudity and explicit sex concealed in things like tree bark and in furniture, and even the muscles seen through Superman's costume. You can see in this picture what I mean, where Dr. Wertham literally says that the comic book industry was worse than Adolf Hitler when it came to destroying lives. This is not a joke, folks. This is not Photoshop. This is an actual quote from the book. Yeah. Just about the only legitimate comment he had made about superheroes was that Wonder Woman featured, bondage imagery and some lesbianism. But then William Marston, the guy who created the character, had always admitted that that was a part of the Wonder Woman story. So, sure, yeah, shocking for the late 1940s, early 1950s. By today, not so much, but back then, yeah, it was shocking. So I guess he made a point there. But in the end, so what? As I said earlier, the 50s saw an uptick in delinquency among children in general. Now, rather than blame this wave of disobedient and sometimes criminal children on, I don't know, how about the fact that a lot of these kids were growing up in homes that didn't have dads anymore because their dads had gone off to fight the Nazis and never come home? Or because they were growing up in abusive environments because the dads did come home but were so messed up with post-traumatic stress disorder that, they were just a little bit damaged. And of course, back then, nobody knew what the hell to do about it. Anyway, rather than look for a solution to the complex problem, American society naturally went for the easy scapegoat. So, not only did adults who had previously been buying the comics stop buying comics, they stopped their kids from buying comics. Stan Lee would recount later that Wertham, and this is a quote, he said, "Wertham said things that impressed the public, and it was like someone shouted fire in a movie theater. There wasn't any scientific viability to it, but because he was an expert and he had the word doctor in front of his name, people took him seriously. It started a crusade against comics," unquote. And, as a result, crime comics almost disappeared. horror comics did disappear for the most part. Superheroes vanished by the dozens until literally only a handful were still published. And, things would eventually get better for comic books, but not for a long while. As a result, the various publishers got together and created the Comics Code Authority. Now, the CCA is the subject of a whole other history of comics video entirely, so I'm not going to get too deeply into it. But suffice it to say that it was a censorship board. Anything deemed too bloody, too gruesome, too violent, too adult, too sexual, too mature, it was gone. It was gone. And what was left, at least initially, was just the dumbed-down, watered-down versions of what the Golden Age was about. Now, granted, eventually the Silver Age would find its own footing, and you could get to enjoy the goofy fun that was generated by the new rules. But at the beginning, the censors effectively killed comic books. So now that all that's done with, you know the general background of how the Golden Age became the Silver Age, and we can get back to talking about Jack Kirby and how he influenced the entire thing. In 1953, at the urging of some of their colleagues at Crestwood, the company that was publishing their romance titles, Jack Kirby and Joe Simon founded their own comics company, Mainline Publications. At Mainline, the pair published 4 separate titles: Bullseye, Western Scout; Foxhole, a war title that was being promoted as, created by actual veterans who know the real feel of war; In Love, which they bought from Crestwood; and Police Trap, a crime procedural they claimed was based on genuine accounts by real law enforcement officers. In 1954, they even tried their hand at superheroes again. In response to Timely Comics relaunching Captain America as a commie fighter with a new creative team, Kirby and Simon created the Fighting American. Joe Simon would later say, "We thought we'd show them how to do Captain America right." While the book originally portrayed the Fighting American as a standard dramatic hero who was fighting he was fighting communist villains, in the aftermath of the Army McCarthy hearings and the downfall of Senator Joseph McCarthy, they ended up turning it into a superhero parody. Unfortunately, as happens far too often when friends go into business together, the collapsing comic book market caused money troubles, and money troubles led to interpersonal difficulties, and interpersonal difficulties brought an end to the partnership between Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Simon would leave comics entirely for a new career in advertising, while Kirby continued to do freelance illustrations, cartooning, and comic book art for various companies. In 1971, Kirby would say, "Joe wanted to do other things, but I stuck with the comics. And that was fine. There was no reason to continue the partnership, and we did part as friends." Kirby not only continued to try to sell new comic book ideas to various publishers, he also made a strong push to re-enter the newspaper comic field. For a time, he assisted his friend and neighbor Frank Giancola on Johnny Reb and Billy Yank, a newspaper strip about the U.S. Civil War, but Kirby wanted a strip of his own. He created several during this time, including Master Jeremy, King Masters, and Chip Hardy, but none of them caught on and were either turned down or were canceled shortly after they debuted. He finally found success with a science fiction fantasy strip entitled Sky Masters of the Space Force. Jack Kirby did the pencils, while the Wood brothers handled just about everything else. Wally Wood as inker, Dick Wood and Dave Wood handling the script and the lettering. The strip was fairly popular, and it lasted all the way to 1964. During this time, Kirby also did freelance work on various comics for both DC and for Timely, which by this point had been renamed Atlas Comics. Most of his work freelancing, in fact, was for DC. Between 1954 and 1957, he created nearly 600 pages of content for the company, including an 11-page relaunch for Green Arrow that has since then been almost completely forgotten by comic book fans and historians alike. Which means that, when you gather together with other comic book geeks to talk about which superhero was the first one published during the great superhero resurgence of the early 60s, tell them it wasn't the Flash or Fantastic Four. It was Green Arrow. How's that for a kick in the head, huh? Kirby made a break from DC Comics in early 1958 because of royalty disputes and because of what Kirby would later call, and I'm quoting, a bunch of pencil necks telling me my job. We might more accurately call it micromanagement these days. Apparently some of DC's editors had criticized him over small details in his artwork, such as not drawing the shoelaces on a cavalryman's boots, or showing an Indian mounting his horse on the wrong side. This meant that by 1959, Jack Kirby was doing almost all of his work for Atlas Comics, which was soon to be renamed again, this time to Marvel. Atlas Comics' line at the time consisted mostly of romance comics, westerns, and the occasional monster comic, and Kirby was put to work on all three. He drew the Rawhide Kid and the Two-Gun Kid, but most of his time was spent on rather lackluster monster books that featured stories like The Escape of Monsteroso and The Creature from Krogar. This went on until 1961, when suddenly things changed. Over at DC, superheroes were catching on again. Gardner Fox had restarted The Flash and the Green Lantern, and heroes who managed to survive the purge of 1954, namely Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, were beginning to sell again. They were beginning to get popular again. Stan Lee, seeing a change in the wind, went to Atlas's publisher Martin Goodman and got the okay to give superheroes another go. Fantastic Four #1 was released on November 8, 1961, and the comics world would never be the same. This was the beginning of the Marvel Empire. This first issue, yeah, it was a little shaky, the story wasn't the strongest, and several parts of it would later be changed by the way of retconning, but nobody could deny that this was a classic Kirby story. What revolutionized the system was Stan Lee's quote-unquote Marvel method. Instead of beginning with a full script that the artist would then illustrate, each comic began with a basic idea that was discussed between the writer and the artist, and then it was drawn and pasted by the artist as he worked. Dialogue and captions would be added to fit the picture later. The method allowed the artist much more latitude and creative freedom than ever before, but it also required that the artist was, he had to be a really good story man himself. And of course, Jack Kirby was a great story man, on top of being a great artist. Stan Lee, describing this division of labor, would later say, some artists needed a more detailed plot than others, and some, like Jack Kirby, didn't need a plot at all. I'd say to Jack, hey Jack, how about we use Dr. Doom as the villain in the next story, and he'd bring in a finished story that had Dr. Doom in it. Sometimes he'd come in and he would tell me his ideas. All I ever really did to his books was just a little editing. The Marvel method would be the bedrock on which the entire Marvel universe was created. The Incredible Hulk followed the Fantastic Four, and Ant-Man followed the Incredible Hulk. Neither of these two titles was as popular as Fantastic Four was, and in fact the Hulk title would be canceled after only a couple of issues. But, they kept it around long enough for the character to become actually popular. After that, Thor appeared in Journey into Mystery, which was previously a crime/horror title, and the final issue of Amazing Fantasy debuted Marvel's most popular character ever, the Amazing Spider-Man. While Spider-Man was drawn by Steve Ditko and not Jack Kirby, his origins date back to the mid-50s when Simon and Kirby were trying to sell new superheroes to various publishers. Along with Night Fighter, Man of Flame, and dozens of other proposed heroes who never saw print, they came up with a character named Spider-Man. Kirby suggested the name to Marvel, and then worked with Lee to block out the first story, but for reasons that still to this day remain unclear, final production on the issue was given over to Steve Ditko. Now, I'm not complaining about that. Ditko did some remarkable work. I just want everybody to know that the character originated with Kirby. Marvel's last monster book, Tales of Suspense, featured the debut of Iron Man. By this point, Kirby was far too busy to pencil Iron Man's origin story, but he did design the character for Don Heck to draw. Similarly, when Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos debuted, Kirby drew several of the initial issues before turning it over to Dick Ayers. The Avengers and the X-Men were introduced shortly thereafter, and as with Iron Man and Nick Fury, Kirby drew the first several issues to establish momentum before turning them over to other artists who could hopefully keep things going. In the early days of the Marvel Universe, Kirby would often pencil or plot 5 or 6 books a month, but by the mid-60s, Marvel had attracted enough fresh new talent that Kirby could cut back on his workload and he could concentrate on only a handful of titles. At this point, primarily he worked on Fantastic Four and Thor and the newly relaunched Captain America. Cutting down on his workload also resulted in a marked improvement in the quality of his artwork. Before that time, he'd been too rushed to do sufficient backgrounding or to pay very strict attention to the details. But with sufficient time to stretch out his creative muscles, Kirby's art became tighter and much more ornate and all the more dynamic. Through his artwork, for example, he transformed Thor from just another superhero title, albeit one with a mythical bent, into a true saga of the gods with its pageantry and its costumes and its awesome landscapes. Kirby's many years of working like a machine had trained him to be able to do good quickly, and being able to do good quickly meant that when he could take his time, good became fantastic. In the mid-60s, Marvel's characters were beginning to appear on television in a series of cartoons, and they were the subject of many different articles and magazines on the renewed interest of superheroes and comic books in general. Marvel was no longer a small, hole-in-the-wall operation. Jack Kirby found it less and less necessary to come into the office or to even involve himself in the design of new characters or books. It was at this point that he relocated his family to California. He'd mail his penciled pages to Marvel's offices from 3,000 miles away. In 1970, after over 100 issues of the Fantastic Four, Marvel's readers were shocked and dismayed to hear that Jack Kirby had resigned from the company completely in order to take up an editorial post and to create a brand new line of comics for DC. Throughout his life, Kirby had been with Marvel longer than any other company, and his contributions to their history and to their success were substantial and noteworthy. But it was time for a change. Kirby felt that Marvel was stifling him. They gave him no room to experiment anymore. Characters that he had created had been pulled away from him and given to other people. Moreover, Marvel had recently been purchased by a conglomerate, and the new owners didn't even give a damn about the comics. They certainly didn't give a damn about the creators of the comics. He personally felt offended that the new bosses at Marvel didn't even know who he was, much less what he had done to build the dynasty that they had just purchased. He felt that he was being treated shoddily, and to be honest, he was being treated shoddily. So, when Carmen Infantino, DC's comics editorial director, offered Kirby a means to get out, he jumped at it. But that's the subject of another video. So there it is, kids. Part 2 of our look at Jack Kirby and his monumental place in comic book history. And always remember that comic book history is important. I mean, a lot of people dismiss comic books as unimportant, but they are. They are our modern myths, and we should be treating them that way. And I know I'm preaching. I know I sound corny, but I don't care. I don't care. Anyway, did you like the video? Did you hate the video? Either way, let me know in the comments below. I really hope you enjoy these History of Comics videos. I love putting them together. I love doing the research and finding things out that I had never known before. And we are going to keep making them, not just for Jack Kirby Month, but on other subjects too. If you like the video, go ahead and hit the like button. If you really like the video, then share it so your friends can see it too. That's always appreciated. Don't forget to hit the little notification bell up in the corner so you never miss another one of our videos. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't subscribed. We're worth the subscription, I think. If you like what we're doing here and you want to give us a hand keeping the lights on and the train running, We've got a VidMe page and a Patreon page linked below. If you feel like dropping $1 in the till, hop on over there. You can give us a hand that way. But even if you don't, we appreciate your time and your attention. And thank you very, very much for watching.